Please give a warm welcome to David McKnight.
All right, folks, tonight we're going to start off with a quiz. I hope they warned you. They sent you all the study material, right? Can anybody tell me the highest tax bracket in the history of our country? What's the worst it's ever been? What do you think? Yeah, so the last 2 years of World War II, the highest marginal tax bracket was 94%. And that was for any dollar you made above and beyond $200,000. So let's fast forward to the decade of the 70s. What was the worst federal marginal tax bracket you could pay throughout the entire decade of the 70s? Now this one's easy to remember. Throughout the entire decade of the 70s, the worst federal marginal tax bracket you could pay was 70%, once again, for any dollar you made above and beyond $200,000. Now let's fast forward to today, 2022. What is the worst federal marginal tax bracket you can pay today? The tax rate at which Bill Gates pays taxes on most of his earned income. 37. So here's my question for you, and this is not a trick question. How does 37 stack up against some of these tax rates we've experienced in the past? What do you think? I do this workshop all across the country. I routinely ask rooms full of people, hey, how bad are taxes today? What do you think they say? Terrible, horrible, as bad as they've ever been. What's the truth? The truth is that tax rates today are just about as low as we've seen in our lifetime. However, something is going to happen in that tax bracket January 1st, 2026. Is it going to go up or is it going to go down? It's going to go up. And in order for that to happen, by the way, what is it going to go up to? It's going to go up to 39.6. And in order for that to happen, all Congress has to do is nothing. Is Congress pretty good at doing nothing? The real question I have for you, however, is this. What is likely to happen to tax rates beyond 2026 as we move forward in time to 2028, 2030, and beyond? What does your gut tell you? Are tax rates down the road likely to be higher or lower than 39.6? What do you think? Raise your hand if you think higher. All right, so that's just about everybody in the room. So my question for you is why? What are the big ticket items? Social Security, military. Well, the first thing we got to talk about is the debt. How much debt do we owe? 30 trillion, that's a 3 and a 0 followed by 12 zeros. Now, I'm not so much concerned about the debt as I am the interest on the debt, the cost of renting the money that we've already spent. We've got Medicare, we've got Medicaid, we've got Social Security. Here's an interesting one, pensions. The other day I was talking to a lady, I said, hey, what happens to your pension if your company goes broke? She says, don't worry, Dave, no matter what happens to my company, the federal government guarantees I will always receive 2/3 of my pension every year till I die. Folks, that's what we call an unfunded obligation. What's an unfunded obligation? It's a promise the federal government's made that they can't afford to keep. Some experts say that what the federal government's promised that they can't afford to pay is about $120 trillion. Can anybody tell me when Social Security was invented? When did they first roll out Social Security? And they rolled it out in 1935. And when Social Security first started out, how many workers were putting money into the program for every one person that took money out? What did that ratio look like? 10 to 1, 4 to 1? It was actually 42 to 1. Back then, how old did you have to be to draw on Social Security? 65. Anybody want to take a stab at what the average life expectancy was back then? It was 62. They didn't even anticipate that the average person would live long enough to ever draw on Social Security. If you were lucky enough to make it to 65, how long did you draw on Social Security before you tipped over dead? Just a couple years, right? Was Social Security pretty solvent when it first started out? You bet it was. It was set up to last forever. And then something happened. Soldiers came home from World War II, and they started to do something at a rate at which they'd never done it before. What did they start doing? Making babies. Thank you for the tasteful way in which you put that. They started to have children. In fact, if you look at demographic trends over the last 100 years or so, it looks a little bit like this. You start off at the turn of the century with what we call the Henry Ford generation. These are our World War II vets. What did Tom Brokaw call these folks? The greatest generation. They were followed up by what we call the silent generation, still sort of reeling from the Great Depression. Then what do we call this big statistical anomaly in the middle right here? Yeah, so these are the baby boomers. Now, did baby boomers have a few children of their own? They had a few. What do we call this? We call this Generation X. So I am a Generation Xer. Now, and we had children of our own. We call this Generation Y. I got 7 kids. That's exactly what I asked myself in the middle of the night. Now, as you look at this chart, Did baby boomers, these folks in the middle, have nearly as many children as their parents did? No. Not even close. In fact, they had almost 30 million fewer children. So if you were to ask yourself today, how many workers are putting money into Social Security for every one person that takes money out, what does that ratio look like today? It's a little bit below 3-to-1. In another 10 years, what's that going to look like? 2-to-1. And what's the earliest you can draw on Social Security today? 62. And if you start at 62, how long will you continue to draw before you tip over dead? Try 23 years or until age 85. Folks, is Social Security today just a little bit different than when it first started out? You bet it is. It started off as insurance against living too long, and it slowly morphed into this pension program that covers us for nearly a quarter of our lives. Well, how many of you guys have ever heard of a guy named David Walker? Does that name ring a bell at all, David Walker? Okay, so David Walker was what we called the Comptroller General of the federal government. He was basically the CPA of the USA, and he did that for 10 years under Bush and Clinton. The reason I'm telling you this is because David Walker knows more about these numbers than just about anyone else on the planet. And he took one look at the books and he said, hey, we have promised way more than we can afford to keep. He says, you think Social Security is bad. He says Medicare is 5 times more expensive. He said to be able to deliver on these 2 promises alone, he said this in 2008, he said we would have to double taxes immediately. He said you don't have to double taxes immediately, but for every year that you postpone doubling taxes, the national debt will grow by $2 trillion per year on average, each and every year until we hit this magical moment in our country when we have $53 trillion of debt. Did you know that if we had $53 trillion of debt, that all of the revenue flowing into the U.S. Treasury at that point under today's tax rates would only be enough to pay the interest on all that debt, let alone any principal, let alone a single dollar for Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, or anything else we listed on that screen. In fact, David Walker was so concerned about this that in 2008 he resigned and started to crisscross the country, raising the warning cry to whoever would listen. In 2010, he wrote a book called Come Back America, in which he sort of diagnosed the problem. And he appeared on NPR to talk about his book. And he told the radio show hostess, he said, hey, look, tax rates have to double or we're going to go broke. And she didn't believe him. So he says, look, I can give you one 4-letter word to explain why tax rates have to double. And does anybody know the 4-letter word that explains why tax rates have to double? Just yell it out. Math. Math is a 4-letter word that explains why tax rates have to double. What did David Walker mean by math? Well, basically what he's saying is saying, look, if this is what you're spending and this is what's coming in, you can either double what's coming in, cut in half what's going out, or some combination of the two. It's simple math. All right, folks, let's get serious here. How many of you guys watch cartoons? Well, a couple of years ago, I was watching the Roadrunner. In this particular episode, the coyote was trying to kill the Roadrunner, and he was building a bomb with which to do so. And what company makes his bombs? Acme. Now we're cooking. All right, so he's building a bomb made by Acme inside a shed that was also made by Acme. And he was so focused and intent on finishing this bomb that he also didn't realize until the last possible moment that there was a huge freight train bearing down on him. The coyote sees this huge freight train bearing down on him, and instead of jumping out of the way, what does he do? He simply pulls down the window shade, thinking that the act of doing so would make the problem go away. Did the problem go away? No, there's a huge explosion, and does the coyote ever really die? No, it's frustrating, right? But as the smoke and fire cleared away, you could sort of see him limping off screen, very much the worse for wear. Why did we gather here tonight to talk about the Roadrunner? Well, as Americans who do most of our saving for retirement in what we call tax-deferred vehicles like 401ks and IRAs, we have a massive freight train that's bearing down on us, and it's bearing down on us in the form of what? In the form of higher taxes. And we got a couple of choices of what we can do about it. We can pretend like the problem doesn't really exist. We can pretend like the math to which David Walker referred doesn't really add up. But isn't that a little bit like pulling down that window shade? Or we can implement some strategies starting right now that can help remove us from the train tracks, thereby insulating and buffering us from the impact of higher taxes.